So, here's 4 weird things about time. Weird thing number 1. Have you ever noticed that the names of the last 4 months of the year are wrong? So you've got September has a 7 in the name, but it's the 9th month. October has an 8 in the name, but it's the 10th month. Same with November. Same with December. What's up with that? The answer, turns out, as I say on the internet, a little surprising. Weird thing number 2. So it's 2017 right now, which is supposed to mean, supposedly, that it's been 2016 years since this happened. Now, don't worry, this is not going to be a talk about Jesus, but cross-referencing historical records and the things in the Gospels and stuff, the general consensus has actually been that this probably happened in around 6 BC. So why is it 2017 right now instead of 2023? Turns out it's a love story, really. Weird thing number 3. This is when you can play along with if you're on a Mac or a Linux machine. If you open up the terminal and go into your terminal and type cal, C-A-L, it's a calendar utility that gives you the days of the month. And what's great with this is you can pick any month of any year and it will give you the days of the month. So for example, go back to Cal 7, 1867, you'll discover the Confederation was signed on a Monday. It's a pretty good way to start your week. But here's another one. Try Cal 9, 1752. And that is a month for 3 weeks. Now, some of you, I think, might be from other countries. You might have a different thing here, but we'll talk about that in a minute. But this is not a bug. But this is because of a bug. But it's not because of a software bug. It's a bug that took centuries to figure out and find, and centuries more to fix. And even actually hasn't been completely fixed yet, in some places. Weird thing number 4. In Christchurch College in Oxford, there's a bell that rings at 9 p.m. every night to tell everybody it's time to come home. But it doesn't ring at 9 p.m. It rings at 5 minutes and 2 seconds after 9 p.m. And it turns out there's a really good reason for this, even though it's a little passive. So, hi, I'm Andrew Burke. I'm an independent software developer from Halifax, Nova Scotia. And I've been doing software for over 20 years now. I started with things like HyperCard and then Lotus Notes, and now I mostly work with Ruby on Rails and iOS. And I've always been interested in the interactions between culture and technology. And a while back, I came out with an iOS app called Remembery, which is a diary app that pulls in your social media feeds and helps you remember what you did every day. Kind of fun, but because it's a diary app, I spent a lot of time dealing with dates and times, and especially time zones. And I had people coming in with book reports saying, I started writing my diary when I got on the airplane in Tokyo, and I flew to Los Angeles, and suddenly I moved backwards in time because it crossed the international date line, and it covered my yesterday's diary entry. And I hadn't really considered that you'd be traveling backwards in time while using my diary. So I started looking up things. I started getting interested and fascinated in how time zones and all these things work. And I started looking things up on Wikipedia, and as you do, I fell into a Wikipedia black hole. You start following links and opening other links and opening other tabs and following other links, and next thing you know, it's 3 in the morning. You don't even remember what 3 in the morning even means anymore because you've been studying time zones. I even started reading books, like actual printed books about this topic, and not only discovered lots of really cool and interesting things, but stuff kept reminding me of a world of software, the kind of world we all live in, technology and culture. And this shouldn't be surprising because deep down, this is really about representing tricky concepts in a way that everybody can use literally every day. So this is basically what we often do a lot of this business, and that's what time is about in many ways. So I just introduced 4 weird things, and each of them has a story that I'll tell. And then I'll have a bunch of lessons that'll come out of this, so there'll be like 12 lessons. So let's get started with weird thing number 1. Why are some month names wrong? So these are the modern months, right? January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, etc. And these are from Latin. And as we saw at the beginning, in Latin, the names of the last 4 months are wrong. Now, since this is Latin, the language of the Romans, presumably the answer comes from Roman history. Now, a lot of people think that this is because the simple answer is that July is named after Julius Caesar, and August is named after Augustus Caesar, they moved on those, all the bad months are right afterwards. So presumably they just rename those months and move the other months back, and simple and clear answer, and there you go. But that would actually be the wrong answer. Because before they were renamed, these months were actually called Quintilis and Sextilis, which is 5 and 6, which means, in fact, half of the year had the wrong month names. So how did it get to be in this? How did it get to be this way in the first place? Well, it turns out that nobody actually knows. These have been the month names for as far back as there's actually been recorded history of Romans using these names. Now, people who were closer to this era, the historian Plutarch, says he had a theory, and he was writing around 100 AD or so, that at the founding of Rome, around 750 BCE, they only actually had 10 months, right, starting in March, and it was going on. But the thing is, those months, and that actually makes the names correct. So you have Quintilis is 5, Sextilis is 6. But the thing is, the months were still roughly 30 days. So you have this big gap at the front of the year. So what did they call it? What did they do with that? Well, turns out they didn't do anything. They didn't bother naming it whatsoever. Now, the weather in January and February in Italy is kind of like March and April in Canada, especially in Nova Scotia where I'm from, where it's kind of damp. It snows, it's muddy, and back then the Romans were basically farmers or warriors, and neither of those are things that you can't really field an army in that kind of weather, and farming is no good. So basically they hid out indoors and waited for the real time to start again. So supposedly that's what they did. They just stayed home and waited. Now, as Rome got more sophisticated and time went past, and they had merchants and relations with other countries, and bankers and lawyers and things like that, they couldn't ignore those months anymore. So they split the space into January and February. But then they just kept the other months where they were, because that way, if your festival is in October, you're not going to suddenly have your festival be some other month. So everything, that way you could just keep all the stuff backwards compatible while you had these extra 2 months at the beginning. And it was great. And okay, so we have this weird legacy thing about the months being the wrong names, but this is just this transition phase. Well, it turns out we've now had these legacy names for about 3,000 years now. And this brings us to the first lesson. So, names have two roles. It is to label something and to describe something. Ideally, it'll do both well, but sometimes the meaning underneath can change while keeping the label on top. And this happens, obviously in technology, we name things a lot. We name variables, functions, classes, we name the packages of software, we name the whole software packages and products themselves. And last but not least, we name the concepts that we like to have our users use. The problem is we have to be aware that the stuff underneath can often change. So think of the save button in Microsoft Word. It still looks like a floppy disk when nobody uses floppy disks anymore. And in fact, those was a weird name anyway, because the icon they make is one of those ones that are encased in a hard plastic shell from back in the day, which is sort of floppy if you know what to look inside, but looks hard. It's very confusing. So our UIs and our culture and our language are full of all these kinds of weird mismatches between the label and the actual thing. They're both valuable. Anyway, sorry. So the names you've been using, lesson 2, are technically wrong, but that's kind of okay, because standards don't always have to make sense. Simply being a standard is sometimes enough. So this is sort of a related point. So really, who cares that October means 8, but it's actually the 10th month, as long as Halloween happens at the end, right? That's really the most important part. The consistency of the label has been much more important over the last 3,000 years or so than the meaning had, the official meaning of this arbitrary label has. So, sometimes just simply being a standard. Lesson 3. Now, the idea that people just didn't bother naming the first, the span of time was the first 2 months of the year is kind of surprising, but it does make some sense, because people don't like to track useless things that suck. Now, as developers, as technical people, as sort of engineers, we are often tempted to put all the details in, right? So for sake of completeness, we want to cover all the bases. But, there's a lot we should really think about what we can completely skip for the sake of making it clearer and easier and more humane for our users to actually use. I always think of this when I'm trying to plan out a process or a UX or a user interface or something. If there's a whole, if the ancient Romans could skip an entire 63rd year, you can probably skip a few steps too, just in terms of making it better. People are much more resilient to incompleteness than you think. So, that was weird thing number 1. Weird thing number 2. Why is it 2017 right? Okay, it's story time. Once upon a time, in the Dark Ages of Britain, Queen Ainfled, that's exactly what she looked like, Queen Ainfled of Northumbria had a problem. Well, she was in the last week of fasting for Easter, fasting for Lent, sorry. Her husband, King Oswy, right? This is exactly what he looked like. King Oswy was already celebrating Easter. Now, this was religiously and politically awkward and it was no good for them. Now, this situation about having Easter at the wrong times, as both being king and queen, turns out to have been the pivot point that determined how most of the world reckons what year it is. Now, in history, most people didn't really count the large span of years. It usually be how many years since such and such king started, or maybe since a major event of some. Only specialists like astronomers and historians really cared about the big picture. And so this didn't really matter for the day-to-day, except for Easter. Now, for various complicated theological and symbolic and historical reasons, Easter is closely related to the Jewish festival of Passover. Now, we have to do a little bit of a technical detour here on some facts. There are some obvious ways to divide up time that every civilization has sort of done. So there's the day, right? This is a standard day and night. There's months, which is the phases of the moon. And then there's the year, which is the cycle of the seasons, and if you're fancy with astronomy, you can tell where the zodiac is and where the sun is. And the thing to point out, though, is that month is a great way to follow a lot of time, and year is a great way to follow a lot of time. But months and years don't fit together very well. We, in fact, have 12.3685 months in a year. So most cultures will pick one and then kind of fudge the other. So the standard sort of Western calendar is a solar calendar. So the phases of the moon are disconnected from when the months start. But a lot of other calendars have been and are lunar. So the Chinese calendar, the Islamic calendar, and the Jewish calendar are all lunar, which is why Chinese New Year is on a different day every year for our calendar here in North America. Same thing with Ramadan, same thing with Passover. And so once again, since Passover is tied sort of to Easter, they had to figure out when to actually have Easter, because it couldn't really be on Passover for various complicated reasons. But after a lot of arguing, which is what people in the early church did a lot of, which is a lot of arguing, they finally came up with 3 simple rules for Easter. So Easter is the first Sunday, after the first full moon, after the spring equinox. Easy, right? Now the problem is, 3 simple steps, right? The problem is this depends on a solar calendar for figuring out the spring equinox, the lunar cycles for figuring out when the full moon is, and this arbitrary 7-day cycle of days to figure out when the Sunday is. So you have to be able to plan all these things and integrate them all correctly to figure out when the next Easter is going to be. Now, there's all sorts of edge cases as well. What happens if full moon's on a Sunday? What do you do then? And there's also things like certain celebrations and other festivals that happen that get in the way, because if your big celebration happens during Lent, no one's going to want to come to the party. All sorts of regional limits and things like that. So, and for a while they had a central authority. Somebody in Rome or Alexandria would send couriers out to tell what it is. But when the Roman Empire is 3,000 miles across, and by the time somebody gets to, say, Scotland, it's already Lent probably. So people needed more than just being told. So eventually people worked out what's called a computus. These are formulas to figure out when Easter is supposed to be. And I love the name computus. It sounds like computer because sort of that's what it is. It is a bunch of algorithms, more or less, to come up with the date of when Easter is. Now, the computus is pretty complex. Here's a modern computus as expressed in Python from the Wikipedia article, which is well worth checking out. It's one of those I spent a lot of time on. So imagine trying to figure this out by hand in Roman numerals without the concept of decimal fractions. Okay, let alone just figuring out, running that calculation, let alone figuring out what that calculation should be, figuring out how do all these things fit together, right? So, I mean, let's go back to these. You ever have that where the management comes down and says, okay, we had 2 weeks of meetings, we came with 3 simple steps for the next process, and they give you the 3 steps, and you're like, how quickly can you get that done? And you're like, oh, I can get that done tomorrow. I can get that done for lunchtime, no problem. And then, you get that. I mean, look at all that code. Look, I love the magic numbers, 29,570. I still don't know what that is. I think it's the number of days in the 17-year cycle of leap years and days of a week. Anyway, it's so complicated. So, and the other thing with this being this complicated is it's easy to get wrong. Right? So everybody had these computuses, compute high, I guess, but they're all kind of slightly different from each other. There's rounding issues and stuff like that. So people ended up becoming attached to the computus that their people had versus other people's. So here's where it starts to get personal. So this is Britain in the 7th century. There's many different kingdoms. It's not like England or anything. It's lots of little kingdoms all sort of competing with each other. So there's Queen Edfled is from Kent, which is a very rich kingdom down in the southeast corner, very close to France. And it's very influenced by European culture, and they had a computus that comes from Rome. And she marries King Oswy of Northumbria. Now, Northumbria is all of the northeast corner of England, all the way up into Scotland. So yes, literally, he is the king in the north. He grew up in exile in Ireland, and then came over to Northumbria later when he grew up. And in Ireland, they have a different computus, because Ireland had been sort of separated out from the rest of the continent in terms of the Christian tradition for a while during like barbarian raids. So they have a different computus than everything else. So the computuses that they both used were different enough that almost every other year, their Easter was on different days, usually about a week, sometimes 2 weeks. And now this is about more than just simply hunting for Easter eggs, because Easter is the biggest festival of the Christian year, especially back then. Also 40 days before that is Lent. We're in Lent right now, where people would fast, they'd do without alcohol, or abstain from meat often, and wouldn't have sex. So you can imagine this would kind of put a cramp on your marriage, as well as if one half the family is celebrating Easter and all getting able to eat and everything after the party, and the other group are still sort of quietly sitting and praying all day and drinking water. It kind of can lead to issues. So Elfled, though, refused to change her ways. And also their children, future kings and queens, were growing up and were being forced to pick which Easter to celebrate. So these factions were being formed, and now these were only a generation away from being pagan. Their parents and grandparents had worshipped Thor and Odin, so this was terrible PR for this new Christianity thing that's coming in. They can't even agree on when their top big festival of the year is supposed to be. So finally, King Oswy called the Council of Whitby in 664, and brought all these theologians and people together and figured this out once and for all. And after a lot of debate, so they loved debating back then, the Council of Whitby decided on the computus used by Elfled, the Roman computus. And so Oswy and his kingdom switched, and soon this was adopted all across the British Isles. And everyone lived happily ever after. Except for Wales, because there's always got to be something. So finally, they could celebrate Easter together, and they lived happily, more or less. Better than these poor folks had. But what does this have to do, really, with it being 2017 right now, right? Well, the computus that won at Whitby was created by a monk named Dionysius Exiguus, or Dennis the Short, or like Little Dan, Little Denny. He based his computus on the silver year calculator in Alexandria in Egypt. Now, Egyptians have been doing very sophisticated calendar work for thousands and thousands of years by this. Partially, they have to really be very, very careful about exactly when the Nile is going to flood. They have good, clear desert skies for doing lots of astronomy. So, at this time, for various complicated reasons, most of them kind of passive-aggressive, they used as a baseline for their calendar calculator the year of the start of the reign of the Emperor Diocletian. Now, this year is what we call 284 AD. Now, Diocletian wasn't actually this bad. But he was the last great persecutor of Christians before the whole Roman Empire converted over to Christianity. So it seems a little wrong to, when figuring out Easter, to commemorate this person's reign by when you're figuring out Easter. So Dionysius, doing his calculations, noticed that everything kind of rolled back really neatly to a year 284 years earlier than this. All your cycles, a lot of the major cycles of leap year and like days of the week, whatever, all kind of lined up nicely with this 284-year earlier date, which is, pretty close, not exactly, but pretty close to the year of the Nativity. So this is a much better thing, obviously, for a monk to base Easter on. It's a much better point. So he decided to use that as a baseline calculations for this big fancy computus that he was making. Even if it wasn't technically accurate, it was 6 years away from the actual, what they assume was the Nativity. Yeah, that's great. So he had this number that he used for Easter, and it's great. But how did this number get used for more than just Easter calculations? Well, in 731, a monk named Bede wrote a book called The Ecclesiastical History of the English People. And it was this huge epic history that covered 800 years from the Roman invasion of Britain all the way to the current day. Now, Bede was from Northumbria. And so for him, the Council of Whitby was really important. It's one of the key elements of this book. And so he was a big fan of this Dionysian computus. And so he started using the numbering system, the Anno Domini, the date system from the Dionysian computus for referencing dates in his book, because he's covering these huge swath of history. It's useful for, instead of cross-referencing the third year of the reign of whoever, let's just give it an actual date. And since you're already using this for Easter calculations, it all makes sense. But the thing is, this book became hugely popular all across Europe. Charlemagne loved it. He was actually illiterate, but you had to go read it to him. Almost every monastery and every library anywhere in Europe had a copy of this book. So it became hugely famous and hugely influential. And other historians started using the same date baselines for their histories. You could cross-reference easily. And then that started gradually feeding out into the bigger population and the greater culture. And so that is why it's 2017 right now. Because of a king, a queen, a dead emperor, a Jewish lunar calendar, 2 monks, and a book. And Jesus, kind of, sort of, but no. So, lesson 4. We saw how tricky calculations in edge cases can lead to multiple compути, and eventually cultures competing based on which computers they use. So, edge cases can become expressions of individuality and culture. If everybody agrees about something, then it's not really an issue. If people disagree about everything, then they don't even really compete. But if people agree about most things, but disagree about certain details, then there are ways to compare. And these comparisons often end up leading to cultural identity. So think Canada versus the USA, VI versus Emacs, Android versus iOS. And these differences often can be about something as small as an implementation edge case, but still they end up becoming a huge part of one's identity. I'm a Canadian Emacs user. Get out of here. So notice, also lesson 5, notice how the year numbering started as a handy sort of scratch reference to make calculations easier, but then got used in a book, which turned out to be super influential, and then the good enough scratch reference became authoritative. Well, temporary things often become permanent. We see this thing kind of all the time in software, and in much of society as well. If you ever notice this, take a closer look at almost anything. There's a big article somewhere about the reason that we start all our arrays at 0 rather than 1 when we're dealing with array calculations. It's weirder than you think. It's all sorts of arbitrary reasons based on a particular IBM microprocessor back in, I think, the 60s, and somebody who liked to go on his yacht. There's, anyway, long story there, but it's interesting to see the arbitrary reasons behind almost everything that's a foundation of what we do. Government policy is another one, laws, etc. These are all kind of weird things to notice where things come from. So, weird thing number 3. What's up with 1752? This is the story of a bug. And remember how Easter is based on the spring equinox? Well, over time, as people worked on these computi over the century, they noticed that the equinox was drifting later and later in the year. So what's up with that? Well, for this we have to go back to ancient Rome again. Now, the ancient Romans, now we saw that days, months, and years don't fit together properly, right? So you have to do months or years. And a lot of cultures, especially back then, including the Romans, would track the months and then kind of fudge the end of the year, and then every so often have an adjustment, add or remove a bunch of days, just sort of arbitrarily at a certain point, to sort of get things back on track. And the problem is in ancient Rome, the adjustment days were done kind of on an ad hoc basis, and usually by politicians, right? So what could possibly go wrong with that? But what's worse is these were considered bad luck. So you wouldn't want to be the politician who then goes and assigns these extra big days when, say, a flood happens or a battle goes wrong, and especially during times of war. And of course, this is ancient Rome, so they were at war a lot. So there would be actually whole decades they would go without making these adjustments, because the war with Carthage, the Punic Wars, went on for decades and decades, right? So, and then they would have these crazy long years where they try to make adjustments back, or crazy short years. This is the kind of thing that makes historians completely nuts, as they're trying to figure out when something actually happened. But this was finally fixed by Julius Caesar. He'd been spending time in Egypt with Cleopatra, and he noticed they had much better ways of tracking time. And so part of the many reforms he did in Rome at the time was he implemented what we call the Julian calendar, which is pretty close to what we have now, which has a standardized month lengths, which sort of alternate between long and short. Then he set up a special thing. They add an extra day at the end of February every 4 years. So it's a leap year, right? So this is a self-adjusting year. You don't have to wait for some politician to do something arbitrary, right? Now, side note, soon after he implemented this new calendar, Julius Caesar was assassinated, not because of the calendar thing usually, but leading up to this gigantic civil war. In the confusion, people misunderstood his instructions, and for the first few decades, they actually counted leap year every 3 years. So yes, this is an off by 1 error from 50 BC. So, if you think of cash invalidation as sort of the old names of the months that never quite got updated, we've actually covered all three of these, and we haven't even gotten to 1000 AD yet. So anyway, the Western world now had a consistent, predictable, self-correcting calendar that didn't involve like manual intervention, and was freed from meddling politicians. This was so useful that it continued even after empires collapsed and society fell into chaos and Europe was invaded by barbarian hordes, right, and everything fell apart. But the thing is, let's go back to our numbers, the year isn't 365.25 days. It's 365.2425 and blah, 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 blah days. So by the time of Dionysius and Enfled, they were already about a week different from the astronomical year, because you figure out things from your equinox, and your equinox wasn't turning out to be on the right day, which is supposed to be March 20th. So by the high Middle Ages, it was actually 10 days of difference. So this is a bug. This is the Admiral Grace Hopper's famous original bug that she found in a relay. It was a moth that had blocked a relay, so they taped it in and said, "This is a bug." So this is a bug in a crucial system that everyone uses literally every single day. Every power in Europe had to figure out how to fix this. Now, this is why I love studying history, because every programmer and team and company ends up having to deal with bugs all the time. But here we're seeing entire nations and empires trying to fix a bug. So finally, in 1563, after many false starts, centuries of false starts, at the Council of Trent, they finally worked it out. So they're going to keep leap year as it is, but instead of, they'll have every 4 years, but then they'll skip leap year every 100 years. But then for the next tiny rounding bit, they will not skip leap year every 400 years. Which was actually one of the more obscure Y2K bugs, because the year 2000 was one of those 400 years. So the 1600 and 2000 were the two only times I've actually had to implement this rule. So a lot of people forgot that. So then cut 10 days out of the calendar to get the equinox back in sync. And everything got matched up again properly. And the council was called by Pope Gregory. And so this is known as the Gregorian calendar. And it's what most of the world uses today. Awesome, right? Bug march is resolved, close the ticket, we are done. But wait. By this time, Europe was now split between Catholics and Protestants, and they didn't really get along. So Protestant churches and whole Protestant countries weren't going to go change their whole calendar because of what some pope said down in the Vatican, right? So for several centuries, half of Europe was about 10 days ahead of the other half. This meant that you could leave France and arrive in England in the past. If you're in parts of Germany where there was constantly fighting back and forth, in the Netherlands and stuff, you could just walk across a river and you'd end up jumping 10 days. This is another thing that gives historians unbelievable headaches. So now, eventually the various non-Catholic countries started coming around and switching each over. I could do an entire talk on all the different ways that different countries tried to adjust and fail in various ways. Now remember how the date slips by every century or so, right? England started worrying about this in the late 1600s. So, we need to figure this out by 1700, otherwise the problem's only going to get worse, right? Because you're going to have another day where it'll be 11 days off. Okay, guys, it's really important now to have this ready for 1700. Now, this is a picture of what British politics kind of looked like at the time. So you can get the sense of how hard it might be to get things done in a timely way. And finally, in September 1752, only 52 years out of date, Parliament finally passed a bill, and in September 1752, they updated the calendar. And that is what you see. Type Cal 9 1752 into your terminal window. That's the adjustment that they had to make to adjust the calendars to get back in sync. What's kind of fun is that actually Cal is a Unix command, of course, so there's an enhanced version called ncal. If you use -E flag and ncal, it has all sorts of extra commands. This gives you the Easter of any given year, which is cool. So you actually do have a computus in your computer, so keep that in mind. Also, the ncal-p gives you their little interior database based on when the year changes based on the locale that you're in. So you can actually, I could have done a whole talk about this. So you can see the Catholic Europe switched in the 1580s, then Protestant Europe switched sort of 1700s to 1750s. Then you got a whole bunch of countries switched in sort of 1919 or so. Interesting point, the Russian Revolution, the October Revolution in Russia actually happened in November everywhere else because they were still using the old calendar. The Turkey's there in 1926, which is I think the latest in the list there. But it's kind of interesting to see all these different things. This is why if you are from, say, France and you try to do this, you get a different date. What's funny is, of course, Canada shows a 1752 date, but at the time in 1752, it was still mostly French. So in fact, they had already switched in the 1580s, but by the time the English had taken over, they'd switched too, so everything was okay. But it would have been one of those situations where the shift would have had to be kind of...
What's up with the Latin date? Yeah.
Latin is the Roman calendar, and they never changed.
Huh.
So at some point in 10,000 years, or 8,000 years from now, there's going to be a weird Latin bug somehow. If people are still trying to figure out the Latin calendar, the actual physically Roman calendar using modern unit system, which they probably will be, because that's us, in the year 10,000. What's interesting is actually not everybody's on board yet. Eastern Orthodox churches, for example, still use the Julian calendar, so this is why Russian Easter and Christmas and Greek Easter and Christmas and such are about a week and a half, 2 weeks later than Catholic and Protestant. So let's just say this. Bugs aren't just in software. Software is simply a kind of a codified process, right? And there are many other codified processes out there. Lost luggage is a kind of a codified process. And that's a kind of a bug, right? This leap year situation was a kind of a bug. So it's interesting to look at things in the world outside of software as bugs, although obviously it's a bit harder to test them and fix them. So for example, applying patches to a live culture can be tricky. Right? Like any bug, when you saw this, you had to first figure out the problem, which took them centuries, then figure out a solution that works technically, and then, even more important, implement a solution that then get people to try to accept. And that turned out to be the biggest headache. As you can see, there were wars fought on this kind of thing. So the problems aren't technical, though, as much as they are cultural. And the cultural problems end up being bigger. And this is an ongoing problem with a lot of software, especially things like social media, where they think they're going to solve a technical problem, and then it turns out, something like Twitter or Facebook, where they had their news algorithm in Facebook was turning out to be, having lots of cultural impact because of all that fake news stuff that was going on. And technical people are often very unaware of the cultural impact of the model. It's a good thing to keep. Lesson 8. Now, this is one of the things I love finding out about history, right? If you think your project is taking too long, or the standard you're working on is weird, or the requirements are conflicted and confusing, and the users are resisting your changes, you're not alone, because every large project is a fiasco. You're not the first, you won't be the last, and many people have probably had it much, much worse than you. So, verdict number 4. By 1752, dates had settled down, but time was just starting to get interesting. Now, telling time has mostly been about figuring out when it's noon, where we are in relation to noon. And noon is pretty easy to figure out, because you can sort of look at when the sun is highest in the sky, and you can use various tools for that, or just look at shadows on the ground. Now, the thing is, of course, as you move around the world, east to west, it's noon at different times, because the Earth is rotating, and it's only noon specifically at one point in the Earth at any given time. And so if it's noon right here, it's 11:59, sort of near Vaudreuil, and it's about 12:01, sort of near Saint-Hyacinthe or whatever. It's sort of, it's not super, super far. If you zoom out a bit, for example, if it's noon here, it's just a bit after 11:30 in Toronto, and it's 12:40 in Halifax, right? So, once you get kind of out, you're getting quite a bit of a distance. Now, the thing is, it's fine to base your clocks on whenever it's noon, locally, when, things aren't moving very quickly, you're mostly walking by, going by foot. And day-to-day activities don't require lots of complicated coordinated timing. But only a few decades after this whole 18th century change in the calendars and stuff, steam power started changing the world. You have these networks of trains were crossing continents, and they were going fast enough that these issues of differences of time, like a few minutes here and there, started becoming a big deal. Soon after this, they got the telegraph, which was communicating instantly with the speed of light, basically all around the world, and suddenly these time differences became this huge headache. Now, sailors had needed really precise timing of what the timing is and everything for quite a while. And so the Royal Observatory of Greenwich had actually codified a very specific starting time of Greenwich Mean Time. And they started this in 1675. Railway networks like this, so they started standardizing on GMT as well. And then finally, all of Britain standardized on GMT in 1880. And North America, Halifax's own Sanford Fleming, did all of this in 1883. And gradually, legally became a bigger deal in the early 20th century. Now, not everybody was a fan of this change. So, because why say it's noon when if you look at the window, it clearly isn't noon, right? So a lot of places resented being mandated the wrong time. Many clocks from that era had dials that had two sets of minute hands, showing the GMT time and the local time. So this is one from the Bristol Exchange in Bristol, which is at 2 degrees 35 minutes west of Greenwich, so it's 10 minutes off. So you see they have 2 minute hands, so they're 10 minutes apart. So you have local time for the farmers coming in, and official time for the trains. Now Oxford is 1 degree 15 minutes west, which is, you guessed it, 5 minutes 2 seconds earlier than Greenwich. So that is why Oxford time is simply the correct time in Oxford. So you're actually allowed to be 5 minutes and 2 seconds late for class because you're not late in Oxford. So lesson 9. The UK is like many other places where the big main city, Toronto or whatever, is resented by the rest of the country. So never underestimate the durability of a passive-aggressive grudge. Oxford time has been going on for 140 years now. Lesson 10. One of the biggest revolutions in time tracking and one of the foundations of our global civilization actually makes things in a certain way less correct wherever you are. Because time zones and stuff, that's not going to be noon when we think it's noon. Wrong but consistent is often more useful than correct and messy. The engineer in us sort of cringes at that because we want to be correct and perfect, but this is true. So, we've learned about 4 weird things and what's going on behind them, and hopefully you learned a few lessons along the way. And all this history may be interesting, right? But we're just all past that now in the 21st century, right? Well, arbitrary adjustments aren't a thing of the past. We've just been dealing with a whole bunch of leap seconds. And Amazon, AWS, and the Amazon cloud is having a lot of issues with leap seconds. They mostly figured it out now by dividing all the seconds in the entire day by a tiny fraction of a second, so that you never actually get that 60th second, which screws up all sorts of cron jobs and everything. So it is an ongoing thing with leap seconds. The calendar switches aren't over either. Well, Saudi Arabia just last year has started moving over to the Gregorian calendar for official business stuff. Obviously, for religious things, they still keep the Islamic calendar, but they have a big reformist prince who's trying to move things more sort of west-facing. So countries are still switching to the Gregorian calendar. And then you get even raw measured time is really strange right now because GPS satellites, for example, already have to take into account relativity based on the speed they're at and the height they're at above a gravity well. So the actual pure time is getting all weird, and they have to actually keep that in mind while they're doing their calculations with GPS. And this is only going to get worse as we start traveling further and getting out into other planets and having all sorts of like that. So 2 final kind of lessons in closing. So our standards and the basic foundations that we base our lives on are actually come from surprisingly random coincidences and situations. That doesn't mean they're not useful or important, but it helps to be aware of how arbitrary they can often be. And how they can maybe even change sometimes if it's really important. In lesson 12. And finally, and this is something I've seen the technology and the software world's wrestling with a lot lately. So the cycles of the sun and the moon are completely disconnected from humanity. We have no influence on them at all. They're about as pure an example of abstract physics as is possible. But as you've seen in this talk, our ways of dealing with this abstract concept have been full of cultural, political, and even personal relationship and religious implications. No matter how abstract something may seem, it can be personal, cultural, and political. So think about this the next time you hear someone talking about, hey, why are you making this code thing so political? Why is this, all these things? Why are you doing that? Well, pure logic of, the core of the code may stand on its own. But as soon as people deal with it, like writing the name, naming a variable, even as simple as that, or using something that a piece of code in their lives, it cannot help but become personal and political. This applies also to all sorts of other sort of pure topics like, race, language, gender, the free market, meritocracy has gone this big up and down in the last few years. Even if something has an abstract core, as soon as it interacts with people, it becomes cultural. So time and dates are all around us these days, on all our devices and on all our systems. And as you see, the ways that we measure and track it have been influenced by centuries of weirdness. So the next time you hear someone arguing that some system is pure or beyond politics, or simply saying, it's as clear and obvious as a clock on the wall, right? Right? Take a look at the device, time on your device, and think of how many coincidences, how many weird, wrong things, how much politics and how much just plain weirdness have gone into the things that underpin the way that we understand and manage the world.